The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Greetings. How's everybody doing on this interesting day? I know in different parts of the country, the weather is doing funny things, so I hope you all are holding up on that. This particular year is promising to be a very interesting one and a challenging one. So I want to greet everybody. Lao Tzu, who was the first one to sign in with his usual sign in on the Ma'afa. Greetings to you, brother. And Sister Robin, one of our faithful sisters and viewers, Gloria Briscoe. Greetings to you and others that come on board, and Brother Ogawa. I want to remind people, for those who come in for the first time, to hit the red subscriber button, and that makes you a subscriber to the show. To M. Jewel, greetings to you as well. If you like the show, hit the like button. And some of you who are observing now, encourage people to do that as they come in to the show. Since we've got the financial contribution thing straight, you can go to the description that you find under this show and click into Pan-African Publishers Cash App and make a donation. I appreciate there have been a couple since we've got this straight, and this will help us out a lot. I just want to note that my wife, Pamela Hurley Tashaka, exactly reversed, but she likes Pam. She was in a auto accident that could have been very, very serious, life-ending. Fortunately, it wasn't. She suffered some kind of serious bruises, but no breaks in the bone or anything, and she's in rehab right now. So y'all could send out your prayers to her. She's doing okay, but that could have been much worse. Sometimes when you're on the edge and things can go one way or the other, you do what you do, and then at that point, uh, we call it luck. The Yorubas call it destiny. Good destiny, good luck. Well, I won't go into the details of what happened, but I just want to say that I'm sure glad that she came out whole. She's in some pain, but it's going over. She's getting over it. She's getting good treatment. So say some prayers for Pamela Hurley Tashaka. In fact, they're now calling her James Bond because of the way in which she saved herself. I'm not going to go into that. I'm just going to say she did some very brave things, and fortunately, they worked. So she's getting, you might call her Tam Bond or Jane Bond, but she definitely did pull something off there, and I'm sure happy, you know. Before getting into today's show, I just wanted to make some further comments on Palestine, and I'll make them again in the course of this discussion. It's very clear that what's going on in Gaza to the Palestinian people is, as the South Africans had presented it to the World Court, genocide. And it's been genocide by bombing and then invasion and shooting. Indiscriminate. Of course, it's really discriminate bombing because they destroyed all the institutional infrastructure of the Palestinians. Their universities, almost all their hospitals, their schools, they literally, deliberately targeted that. But specifically, they've targeted the people, and the propaganda that keeps coming out of 28, 29,000, that's pure bull. There is no way in the world that they can say that when most of the housing of the Palestinian people in most of Gaza has been destroyed and the people are buried under the rubble. And so the media is more than happy to minimize the casualties while constantly pushing this story that over 1,000 Israelis who were killed by the Hamas attack was the greatest attack against Jews since the final solution. Really? That was no good. I didn't like it. But when you're in a situation of domestic colonialism, where your land has been taken, your people have been oppressed for years, over 70, and people have been put on a starvation diet in both Gaza and the West Bank. And while they're bombing people to death in Gaza, they're going in and killing people in the West Bank and have taken a huge amount of land that at this point kills the possibility of a two-state solution. And now they're telling people to go to Raqqa because they bombed everywhere else, and or to leave it. They're telling them to leave it when they've been running from one place to the other, and every place they go, they bomb them because it's clear that this is genocide. They want to clean the Palestinians out and move settlers in. And in fact, the settlers have had celebration conferences over what's happened. So we have to support the Palestinians. There should be an end to the violence. They call a ceasefire. Shouldn't even be a ceasefire. Just end the violence, period. But one thing is certain, the world has rose up on this. And Netanyahu, who is prime minister of Israel sees that he prevents himself from going to prison as long as he can sustain this war, because once the war is over, the Israelis are going to throw him out of office, and then he's facing charges. And so he is pursuing this war in part to keep himself out of jail. And the Americans are as involved in this as the Israelis because it's American bombs, American airplanes, American weapons, and American strategic support, because America sent in military advisors to advise them on how to handle this. And even though Biden is now saying he doesn't approve of this invasion because it wasn't planned, that just means he's approved of it. You know, he should say, stop it. He should have said that in the beginning. So our hearts go out to the Palestinian people, and whatever you can do to support them. There are demonstrations around the country. Whatever you can do it. And we know when Ferguson took off, the Palestinians were one of the first non-Black groups to rally in support of the people there and in support of what became a Black Lives Matter movement. And they deserve our support. For no other reason, they're human beings and don't deserve this. And then because domestic colonialism, by its nature, generally means genocide, because the people who go in to take the land want to erase the people who are there. And that's how domestic colonialism has worked under white rule. We should know it because 90% of Native Americans and most of the Aborigines and the Tasmanians have been wiped out the same way in Australia and Tasmania. So today I have an important topic, and it's one that it took me a while to figure out because it sets the tone for what this show will be covering throughout this year. So the topic is the making of Black revolutionaries. Now, when I came up with the topic, I knew that I had heard that title somewhere else because that's the title of James Foreman's book, who was the executive director of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I didn't pick the topic because I remembered that title. It was because it was an appropriate title. And then I remembered, well, I know it came from somewhere. And then I remembered, yeah, it was James Foreman, who played a very important role in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee as the person that saw that resources and everything else got delivered to field staff and did other kinds of work. A great man. So this is the opening, really, even though this is the second month for this year's show, because I've been thinking through a number of things in terms of themes and stuff and topics for this show. And this is an introductory thing for this show because it's speaking to the need for fundamental change in America and in the world, from a system of oppression, a system of racism, a system based on savagery, barbarism, and genocide, which is why it was savage and barbaric, and slavery, and land theft, half of Mexico. And had they succeeded, all of Canada. This country's been a greedy country, and greed has really driven slavery, and it has driven genocide. So this is a kind of going to the high ground and going to a very important place in our culture so that we can take an overall view of how we attack the problems that affect us. So this year, we face a very important challenge. It's either fascism or its defeat through the leadership coming out of African or new African culture, which will be the cutting edge here in terms of its defeat, in the form of revolutionary Black nationalism. And of course, in overturning or preventing fascism, that will not in and of itself be revolutionary, but it could be life-saving. And if you don't consider that important, then just wait and see what will happen if you don't do anything about this. So there's an overall issue of fascism raising its head. And I find it funny when people say, well, what is fascism? You shouldn't have to ask that question, since we lived under it during the entire period of enslavement. And the world has experienced it in different places. And so fascism, which is a political system where a few people come to power and pursue an agenda that is totalitarian, that wipes out any say-so from the people. And we must admit that say-so here is limited. They call it democracy. It's really Republican government. And you often have a choice between two of the same thing, except this time it ain't two of the same thing. And I've been talking to some of our African-centered scholars who have a real influence on people and asking them one question: what do you see about this year? And so I've been putting a fire under their butt to tell them, you better not be coming up here talking this ADO stuff. You better not be talking about, well, since the Democrats haven't given us reparations, don't vote for them. When in fact, Biden signed on to it because he wanted to be elected. I know he ain't no firm believer in reparations, and I'm not looking for a reparations bill from him unless his butt is about to be kicked. But it ought to be clear that under Project 2024, Trump and them are telling you they're going to install fascism. They've told you. Their defense, even in court, has said that the president has unlimited authority, that he should be able to go out and kill anybody he wants to. Well, what do you think it means when he's president again? And his brother Ogawa has reminded me, if he gets in, he ain't going to want to leave. And he's going to be stacking his administration with everybody that's going to do his will. And he doesn't even know what his will is. Huh? This boy doesn't have a consistent thought. So it's the year of fascism, or it's going to be the year where revolutionary Black nationalism, because the people who make the real change decisions are usually coming from this level through African American culture, is going to determine, along with others who join, the future of this country. So that's a number one for getting into this topic today, the making of Black revolutionaries. But more important, and this is the more important reason for this discussion, this is the historical era of a choice between two cultures. A point that I make in my book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap, caused by, see on the bottom, a choice between two cultures. Those words come from God. Those are not my words. I'm not going to go into how I went through this. I've discussed it before. For people who are new, go and watch some of the other shows. But this succinctly describes the challenge that is facing the world and is especially facing Black communities. And so what we are seeing is the powerful forces that hit Black communities since '68 in the form of deindustrialization, breaking up Black communities, killing off Black leadership as they dry up good paying jobs, dropping drugs in the Black community and creating an alternative death culture to compete with this culture, and then raising up a prison industrial system where we've got more people incarcerated in this culture than anywhere else. Um, so we are faced with the fact that we have a choice between two cultures because these forces that have hit our communities have put us in the position of choosing between African, or what I call new African culture, and European culture or Aryan culture. This is the same problem that Africa and the Caribbean faces under neoliberalism, which we face also, where big business has decided to grab everything and left people only with crumbs, whereas before they gave you some crumbs. You know, sufficiently paying job that you might be able to buy a house and buy a car and put your kids in college. Everything is off the wall. Housing is so expensive that people are going homeless. And education is so expensive that when they get a college degree, they're lucky if um, we are able to live and pay the debt for an education that the state should be paying for. When I went to school, university, $100 a year. And that was true in the state of New York and a number of other places. But when the corporations came in and sold or ordered the politicians, which they drink at their will, to go along with this, then neoliberalism puts the price tag on that. And now you've got professors who can't get tenure and they're getting paid starvation wages, just as most everybody else is. So in the Caribbean and Africa, as I pointed out before, structural adjustment or aid that has come on condition that they destroy the services that they were offering to their people, healthcare, education, and other things. And now this same thing has hit whites, and you're seeing their life expectancy go down. They have a culture of despair that has replaced uh, their culture of optimism that was based on whites getting more crumbs than blacks. So this choice between two cultures is the nature of this era. And anything we do to produce change is going to have culture as a central component, as it is in this discussion on the making of Black revolutionaries. Um, so the choice between two cultures is the choice between a mad Euro-American and Euro-Aryan culture that's based on power, racism, greed, and new African or African culture that is based on some key principles that drive us and give us inspiration, which I will go into in a minute. And it is this culture that provides an alternative, our culture, that provides an alternative to this oppressive Euro-American culture. One of the key things, and this has been the reward, but this is a hard reward. As a revolutionary, I took the path of drawing on my own history and my own culture to draw revolutionary principles. Malcolm was in the process of doing that, and some others as well. Among the African centered scholars, major ones, I'm the only one that's a revolutionary. But my revolutionary thought comes from action. I'm a revolutionary scholar, but and that has provided some alternatives. I'll get into that later that are revolutionary, but it has come through battles, successful battles, that has transformed me. So my reward has been drawing deeply into the well of African and African American culture. And that's a hard road to take because it's much easier. And when I say this, I I want to point this out. I keep pointing this out. I'm not anti-Marxist. I'm not a Marxist, but I don't take a position opposed to it. When when we put forward the only successful Black power and Black freedom movement across the board in the United States in the North, from 63 to now, the San Francisco Freedom Movement, we were red baited. And some of our allies were attacked as being communists. And my response and the response of another major leader of the movement, Dr. Nathaniel Burbridge, one of the four radical leaders of the NAACP in the 60s, both of our responses mine was, because at that time Khrushchev was in power, said if Khrushchev wants to come and join the movement, he can. Just he has to follow our orders. That's all. And Dr. Nathaniel Burbridge, who was a beautiful brother and a radical, he took the same position. So I'm not anti-Marxist. That's a position of the system, because, the system uses red baiting. And in this particular case, dumb baiting, because they're going to say that anything that really is good for the people, they call it socialist. Nathaniel Burbridge, Brother Shabazz, Burbridge. And he's on the cover of volume 2 of my book, The Art of Leadership, a beautiful brother. He set up the medical system for Indonesia when it was under Sukarno, who was a radical nationalist, whose government was eventually overthrown by the United States in Indonesia, and 1 million Indonesians were murdered. Burbridge was a good friend of mine. And one of the things we enjoyed in the San Francisco Freedom Movement is no conflict between groups because we buried our egos. And that's a key thing to be successful in a movement. But I want to make this point in stressing the topic, the making of Black revolutionaries. One of the advantages you have when you draw deep from your culture, African and New African, and I want to stress this also, I am quite aware that African American culture has its contradictions, obviously arising from slavery. And the degree to which a Black person is tied down by the negative contradictions coming out of slavery, then to that degree, they're going to have to go deep down inside themselves and work it out. So the issues of self-hatred, the issues of colorism, a lot of the damage that has come from the brutality that came from slavery, and a lot of things that affect interpersonal relationships, a lot of abuse that occurs in family that have a direct relationship to slavery. And then some of it is post-1968 stuff that comes out of drugs and other things. Some of us, even though this culture that we have is African-based, some of us have real trouble with Africa. And only under certain circumstances will we rise to show any pride in it. Yet it's the basis for our existence in a new form, this new African cultural form. So some of the violence that we have in the Black community isn't just drug driven, it's self-hatred. I understand this. So when I'm raising up the culture, I don't make the mistake of thinking that I don't know the other side. Every time they sent an assassin to kill me, it was a Black person. Black people didn't send him, but it had to have been a self-hating Black person because they didn't even know who I was. They just got the assignment. Or if they did, they knew better, but they really didn't. And so if you're looking at like a Clarence Thomas, he's a perfect example of somebody who came out of a rich culture, coming out of South Carolina, Geechee, but at the same time, this deep sense of self-hatred. He said, you got to hate the people who got their behinds kicked. Why would you hate the people? Why wouldn't you? And I'm not saying you need to hate it all, but if you do, why wouldn't it be the people that did it? And then why wouldn't you figure out how to win? And then he was a part of, at least he was growing up during a time in which we were winning, but he doesn't see it as victories like some of us to this day don't, because that's another complex we inherited from slavery. We're powerless. We throw around white supremacy like the term, like it's some kind of weapon, when in fact, it's their term. They came up with that. And they're not supreme in the world anymore. Their power's going down. You hear me? It's going down the tube. So when I talk about this culture as a real basis for revolutionary transformation, both African and African American or New African, I understand the contradictions, and those are things we have to work out. But I also want to say this. This comes from Ray Richardson, who's passed on the other side. She died, I think, at 98 years of age. Was one of my spiritual mothers. I've talked about her before, co-owner of Marcus Bookstore, along with Julian Richardson, who was also like an intellectual father for me, Wade Nobles, Dr. Asa Hilliard, and many others. And she made this comment. She said, as messed up as we are, we're not as messed up as whites are. And then she said, and we're smarter. So if you want to put this, I've said this before, but I thought that was a good summary. You know what I mean? And then some of us aren't that messed up. It depends on your circumstance too. See? So, and I also want to note Naeem Akbar, who was one of the Afrocentric Black psychologists, a team of four of them, Wade Nobles, Naeem Akbar, a brother named Khatib, and Dr. Phil McGee. And they at one time all were on our, no, all except Naeem were on our faculty. He said this: we came out of slavery normal. Now that's a psychologist, and he's a real smart guy too. Huh? We came out normal. I would say more than normal. We came out humane, with heart. Whatever scars we had, with heart, with love, with care for each other. Now, we had some that were just completely messed up. Those are the exceptions. The Clarence Thomases are not the rule among Black folks. So I just want to make this comment. But I also want to say that in dealing with this topic, the making of Black revolutionaries, when you draw from the well of African and New African or African American culture, there's something very special you get in return if you draw from its depths. And that is, you are able to pipe into the higher intuitive mind that is grounded in spirit. Now, that's what you really get. And when I talk about the revolutionaries like King, like Ella Baker, like Malcolm, like Garvey, that's what they piped into. And this was the real greatness of their contribution, because they brought dignity to the enterprise of freedom. And that isn't always the case. And so I'm not anti-Marxist, and I've studied Marxism. And, I think that they have a correct analysis of capitalism as far as it goes. Except Marx missed a few points, like slavery was the basis for the surplus value or the profit that made capitalism. He seemed to forget this. How do you? He left it out. And of course, he didn't study African culture. He didn't study Native American, though Ingalls drew from the study of the Iroquois Confederacy done by Morgan. So the most advanced, most humane, most radical systems in the world, he didn't study. But here's the real problem with Marxism for me. It's, another strength of them is that They want to equally distribute the wealth. That's what they call for. So that's another reason why I'm not going to oppose anybody that's proposing that. I'm just not going that way. And I advise you to check it out yourself before you do, because it's also lazy. You're looking for somebody else, some dead white man, in this case, a Jewish person, to whatever his ethnicity, doesn't matter, who doesn't even know your situation, to give you what they call a scientific solution. And there ain't no science in any human enterprise. It's all an art. And it's all culturally influenced, all of it, you know. So the big problem with Marxism is they're drawing from the lower mind of reason, free of intuition, free of the higher mind. And I understood what Marx said when he said that religion's the opiate for the masses, and I would agree with their, Western Christianity, Judaism, and maybe Islam, maybe, But African systems are spirit based, and they ain't got no God up there dictating to them. You hear me? And it's interesting that there's no word for faith in Kemetic language. Why? Because faith implies blindness. Huh? Does anybody say I have faith in 1 and 1 equals 2? Do you? You know 1 and 1 equals 2. And how in the hell can you look at a magnificent cosmos and think it just all came into being? You ain't even interested in that, really? But I would understand why you'd think that if you've got a male killer cult where some god is up there telling you what to do. So when I'm talking about spirit, as you're going to see, and I have to be honest, when I joined the Black Liberation Movement, that wasn't the first thing that came out of my mouth. But I've always had this intuitive sense, and I've always believed in right. And my first promise was, because I didn't join the movement to lead anything. When I joined it in 1960, that no harm would come to anything I did, to any people that followed me. No harm. And I put in place checks to see that nobody'd have to worry about my mistakes causing anybody problems. And I'll go into that later. Those were my checks, because I know I'm human. I make mistakes. And my mantra to most people is, don't follow me, follow the truth. That's what I'm trying to follow, So the problem with the Marxist point of view, and again, I'm saying I'm not anti-Marxist, and I'm not just saying that to play a game. I'm serious. The problem is they're dealing with the lower mind, the rational mind. And that's the mind of the Aryan. That's the mind of the European, the Euro-American. And it follows in all fields of thought. I'm finishing a book on SEBA, which is the teaching methods to replace, because I'm revolutionary, to replace their teaching system, which is a programming system. You go to university, I don't care what it is, you're getting full of facts, you feed them back, you pass. The more you remember, the better the grade. That's not thinking. That's not creativity. That's programming, and that's training. That's how you treat a horse or a dog. You know what I mean? And that's why most, people on the streets who call themselves educated, they will say of this miseducated person, ask them a question, they'll give you somebody's quote, someone else's opinion, because their head is full of facts. And facts, there's nothing wrong with facts. But that isn't the way you get to the truth, through facts. Truth tells you which facts are right and wrong. Truth then will lead you to see how facts really fall in line, because facts fall in line when they're consistent with the truth, So this lower mind then leads when people come to power, note these revolutions that have occurred under Marxism. It's usually one person dictating everything. And what's the real thing going on there? Power. You hear me? Some may be more reasonable than others, and some more destructive. So Stalin just went on a rampage. Castro allowed a lot of people to leave his island. And I like Castro. I'll talk about his influence, at least the Cuban Revolution, on me later. I like him in a lot of ways. But he had to have the final say-so on everything. And that's why they say of the Cuban Revolution, very successful in education, healthcare, and I would add their intelligence agencies that outfoxed the United States. Their sports. He was himself a good athlete, but not very good on breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And you can blame it all on the embargo. Sorry, you were able to build an educational system, a medical system that's one of the best in the world, in spite of the embargo. Had you let those Africans have a say-so in how they built up their economy, because the African is entrepreneurial by instinct, but not capitalist. And we'll go into that in a minute. It's one of the principles in our culture. If you'd let them soar, they probably have a lot of breakfast, lunch, and dinner and wouldn't have to have all this food rationing and everything else. So I'm glad that I stuck with Africa. But I did it out of love, you understand? As Malcolm did, and as a whole lot of others did. And some who didn't do it consciously did it as well. That would include the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who did it as well, because they drew from the depths of our culture. So some of you may think that in terms of defeating Trump, it's nothing. Well, I'm going to tell you something. I'm not into electoral politics. I never got in any political campaigns, none of that, you know. But I know history and I know time, and I know this is a special time. And for those of you that don't see it, well, don't close your eyes. So the fact is that when we talk about the making of Black revolutionaries, the defeat of Trump in 2020 was an electoral defeat produced by African American or New African culture expressed in the political form of Black Lives Matter and their allies. And some of you are putting them down. You think they stole money. That's bull. They need to put their story out there. That isn't what's happened, you know. But the key thing is these young people who a lot of people were asking, what's happening with them? You know what I mean? Y'all gave birth, the younger people gave birth to hip hop. But then what happened to the politics? And people were asking this question. And then came Ferguson. And you got the beginning of an answer. And you had people smart enough to frame the murder of Blacks, males and females, as a concern of Black Lives Matter. That was a brilliant formulation, because then it put anybody who would come in and say, all lives matter, don't white lives matter, as if they've never not mattered, put them in the position of foolishness. But it came out of the hearts of some sisters. You hear me? And there's a reason why you see a greater preponderance of sisters in leadership now, the breaking of social structures, the weakening of families. 29% of our families are two-parent households. So sisters are holding up a huge load. And some of them have done their homework along with the younger brothers. And they've taken some of the best pages that come out of the 60s and before and have refined them and have done quite well with it. And yet I don't see the Ignornet or even the Afronet, because you know the Ignornet that's the internet that, you know, plays to ignorance, and that's the majority of what people are watching. the ones with the million followers who are up here scratching their heads and cursing out sisters and using the B word on them and everything else. And a lot of sisters watch it. I'm saying, oh, really? What's wrong with you? So, you know, if we look at what's been happening, the issues that have been put out there, it was this awakened Black youth that took it into the streets behind George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and raised up the human rights issue combined with the mismanagement of COVID that led to 40% of the deaths in this world coming in the United States. And by the way, Brother Shabazz, that's not true. Those sisters stole money from the movement. Which sisters? The fact is, I'm going to just give you this aside. Black Lives Matter needs to come out and explain this. But the sister who was managing the money, Kalar or whatever her name is, she was one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, put some money into a big house that they used for movement activists. That's not how I would have used the money. And then they used money to pay organizers. And then she came under attack, which was false. She hadn't taken any money. This woman made all kinds of money on Netflix. She's an artist, you know. And so she then turned the money over. Originally, I think that they had a group of elders in the movement that they respect. They brought in some people, but they didn't like how things were going, so they backed out. And then she picked a brother to manage the money. And this is the story you haven't been told. And so she thought that, you know, Black Lives Matter would be in charge of this. He ended up taking control of it. Ain't no sisters took anything. Some Negro up there who has got his hands on the money and everything else. And the people in Black Lives Matter that know this have not publicized this to the larger audience, to the conscious audiences they have. And so then there's also been a reframing of Black Lives Matter to put it more under grassroots community control. So that's not the case. And when you assert something, come up with the evidence, and you can't, because that's not true. But going back to my point, so it is the issue of humanism around the issue of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, along with people being cooped up due to COVID, and Trump doing everything he could to kill people, nothing really to help them. And then some of the medical systems that we don't have in this country not working, because you don't really have a medical care system anywhere. And governors like Cuomo in New York doing the same thing as Trump, acting like they knew medicine better than the people who do. And so for a variety of reasons, you had a huge death rate, and Blacks suffered 40% of that death rate. And in places like Louisiana, most of the deaths. And so it drove people to madness. And so the combination of the issues of police violence, people being cooped up in their homes and dying because of mismanagement of COVID. I mean, at one point, Trump, even by his son-in-law, was given some alternatives that would have saved a lot of lives. And then he said something about, well, that's Democrats that are going to die, so what difference does it make? And then he knew he had such a hardcore of true believers that they wouldn't care what happened as long as Trump did it. And so, you know, they came back and voted for him in large numbers. They just got outvoted. So the key point is that Black Lives Matter and their allies in picking up this issue around the death of Black males and females at the hands of the police hit on a human rights issue. And humanism is a central principle of African and African American culture. It's a key principle. And when you raise up a human rights issue at the right time, it can galvanize people into action. And so you ended up with 50 states in motion and 50 foreign countries. The biggest mass movement that this country has seen in its history. It cornered Trump and put him out of the White House. And I predicted it in my second or third show. If you go back and look at it, I did a post-Reconstruction analysis and so forth. Before it happened, I told you how it would happen because I'm a strategist. But these young people, they did the strategy. And so you don't think this means anything? Kemet is more important to you than your own lives right now? The example of Kemet should show that what you learn from the past applies to the present. And so that's the basis for producing change today. I see Brother Shabazz has got some information on the federal filings 20 to 2022. The numbers are right. They're close to 100 million that they ended up getting. But I'm just telling you, it wasn't pocketed by these sisters. Okay, so the point is, in discussing the making of Black revolutionaries, it's revolutionary alternatives that are going to make a lot of difference in producing change. So the organizing methodology or methods employed by Black Lives Matter and their affiliates grew out of New African or African American culture. A central principle in our culture, African and African American or New African, is democracy. And I've discussed this in other shows. Not the democracy they talk about here, but where males and females run at every level, not just through the vote, but through everything else. And this is a central principle that Black Lives Matter drew from, and the conscious, the really advanced leadership knows that. Others, it was an expression that is basic to them, and they may not know the history of democracy in African cultures. We gave birth to it in the world through hunter-gatherer systems, and then later classless age grade societies that Chancellor Williams analyzed in his book on the destruction of Black civilization. So they drew from that. And then they came up with what's called group-centered leadership. Technically, its first root that many of them were familiar with came from Ella Baker, one of the people we'll be looking at today. Her group-centered leadership model. But that leadership model, which is a key part of African American culture, it's not the only form of leadership we practice, but it's the best form, and it's the best form suitable to today. This group-centered leadership that Ella Baker was practicing comes out of the hunter-gatherer and classless age grade societies where the people were the leaders. There was no single leader. So in a time of breakdown of communities, breakdown of families, and the general societal breakdown, then young people are not going to be running to any singular leader to give them an answer for anything, and they're smart to take that position because there's no singular leader that's going to have the answers. They're too complex. And, strong movements don't need strong leaders. Weak movements end up with strong leaders. And so, we had our period of the charismatic leader. And there's a role for charisma because we definitely like some good speaking. But good speaking should not be confused with leadership. That's a message. And it's the people who should determine the message, and good leaders follow the message of the people. So, my topic for today, the making of Black revolutionaries. Why is this important? Since the Marcus Garvey movement and then the Black freedom, Black power, Pan Africanist movements of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Africans in the United States have become the leading revolutionary force centered on new African culture and our position in this country. Let me repeat that. Because we underestimate our own power, we don't understand sometimes what's going on right under our eyes, but then some of us do. Some of you do, because I know this is a conscious viewership. But it's important to understand that since the Marcus Garvey movement and the Black freedom, Black power, Pan-Africanist movements of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and since then, Africans in the United States have become the leading revolutionary force centered on African and new African culture and our position in this country. And I'll go into both of those. So since the 1950s, African nationalism, Pan-Africanism on the African continent, and its practice in this country as well, and the Caribbean, Asian nationalism, and the culture of Africa that inspired the Cuban Revolution. Because if you look at the Cuban Revolution, the primary impetus, the primary inspiration was a man named Antonio Maceo. I have some pictures of me in Cuba in 1983 and 1984, representing the National Black United Front, and there's one picture of his death in battle. But the pattern that Castro followed was basically the pattern of Antonio Maceo, going to the Sierra Madres and then waging a war for liberation. And a heavy propaganda war, because Antonio Maceo, who was African, and his family, a number of his brothers served as leaders in the Cuban Revolution at that time. They carried along with them a horse that pulled a printing press, and that printing press laid out their political positions while they were leading a campaign against the Spanish. America intervened to prevent the rise of a Black republic in Cuba. The majority of the population of Cuba is African. And while Castro was white and did a lot of good things, saying that the stranglehold on decision-making was a weakness, he did a lot of good things. And one of them was to go into Angola with a volunteer army heavily made up of African Cubans to kick the South Africans behind. What nation in the history of the world has put their own lives at stake for another nation? So this is the key thing about the role of revolutionary nationalism, in this case, Black nationalism for us, Asian nationalism for the Asians, that has hit the world. So the leading force for change in the world has not been the white working class. Many of them are Trump supporters. So why have Africans in the United States become the leading revolutionary force for change? I've already noted in previous shows that the African American or New African culture is the culture of popular choice in the United States and throughout the world. And there's reasons for it. The US has to roll out the information agencies, the propaganda, the lies, and then they have to send in troops and everything else to show their power. But all it takes is the inspiration of this culture expressed in the form of resistance expressed in its art form as well, because we often confuse the art form with the culture. We created a new African culture in slavery based fundamentally on African principles with some new ones added. And we created an art form. And that's a hell of an achievement. Enslaved Africans did that. And that tells you the state of mind and the state of consciousness, the state of the cultural condition of our people. And they were able to do that because they were African. They were the most African among us. And so it's the ingredients of this new African culture, as it is true of the African culture, that creates the appeal, draws people to it, gives the African in America the inspiration for living. So the cultural ingredients, there are many. I'm just going to discuss a few because this is the basis for Pan-Africanism, African nationalism in the US, and revolutionary African nationalism. These ingredients are first and above all else spirit, not religion, spirit. And that is the number one principle in African cultures. We've discussed this before. And it is piping into this that gave us the courage to fight. And it is piping into this that has enabled us to be as creative as we are. So spirit is first, and then family. As much as they attacked the family, it proved to be resilient, and especially the extended family community that has been weakened by drugs at this point, the intrusion of the drug traffic in the Black community. This is a culture of freedom, in part because any culture founded on spirit will be freedom grounded. But in large measure, as we know, because of the denial of freedom. And so it is a precious thing for us. And an expression of freedom is improvisation and innovation, which are key expressions in new African culture. And it is also expressed democratically, and in group improvisation. And so it's doing things sometimes on the spur of the moment. We can put together stuff like the musicians do that's absolutely beautiful and is suited for the occasion and even surprises us when we do it. And there are other principles as well. And I'll stress one that is really important. It is one that really transformed my own thought pattern, is that in the Euro-American, Euro-Aryan culture, it's a philosophy of either or. It's good or it's bad. It's right or it's wrong. It's black or it's white. But in our culture, bad is good. We have a twin mentality. The blues are the spirituals. I've discussed this before. And this was part of what helped me reshape my own thought pattern. And I'll mention it when I talk about El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, his transformations. A lot of it could be traced through his thought pattern. And this was a big transformation later in his life. From the either or dualism, house Negro or field Negro, to understanding that what we had in common transcended a lot of things. And so it was this idea that things are connected. And so where there's so good is bad. God is the devil. Now, there's no devil really, but if you're going to have one, particularly with the characterization of God you got, in the major Western religions, or, Islam, Judaism, then God's got negative traits. God doesn't have negative traits, but that's their portrayal. So, if you're going to convey the idea that God is good, well, there's going to be some bad up in there, but that ain't the way God works. God's all good. Remember what they say in Medu Neter, people came to this earth and decided to do wrong. I'm paraphrasing this. God said, I didn't command them to do it. And God doesn't command, by the way, contrary to what you think. God's not a dictator. I'm not going to say God's a Democrat either. God's all powerful. But God lets us do our thing. And then when we do our thing, and then when they do their thing, we turn around and blame God. God didn't have nothing to do with slavery, colonialism, or imperialism, or racism. Huh? God didn't send nobody down from heaven with any of that in their heads. They picked it up here. Huh? So if we're looking at why the African is the leading revolutionary force in the United States today, and others follow behind this revolutionary force, it is because of the beauty of this culture, but it is also because of our position. I'll talk about position later. And so the beauty of our culture, of the beautiful spirit, when you pipe into that higher vibratory force, that higher vibratory force ultimately is love. And that's a healing force. And when you're drawing from that, when that's your motive for revolution, then the change is going to be good. You won't end up with a Russia where terror is the major component of their program proposed by Trotsky to Lenin. And Lenin embraced it. And then Stalin, because he was a natural born killer, he just killed for pleasure. Huh? In the name of revolution. What kind of revolution is that? You know, killing your own people. So this cultural complex is a mix both of Africa, and then what happened when we had to rework Africa in America. We had to be more creative here because of the numerical thing that hit us. This was becoming a successful settler colony where the Native Americans were being wiped out. And as a result, overwhelmingly, the numbers were shifting to favor whites, even though in some parts of the South, we were a majority. And so we had to do things to keep this culture going that someone in the Caribbean didn't have to do. They could just continue it because they were 99% of the people in the country. So it took some real creativity to pull this off. And that's why I say the ethos of the African in America is creativity. All human beings have the capacity for creativity. But ethos, which is what makes you distinct in the world, that's us. We don't like to do the same thing twice. We don't like to sing the same song the same way, cook the same meal exactly the same way. And if you're in battle, fight the same way, because that's the way you lose. Because your enemy is real good at figuring out what you're going to do if you've done it before. He's got systems for that, you know? So you've always got to come up with another angle. But that's our nature. It's the nature of all people to be creative, because it's the essence of God, creativity, goodness, truth, love, but creativity. God created all this stuff out here. That's why in innovations in science, there's no such thing as a scientific creation. It's a discovery of laws already there that God already created. And we know so little, it's funny. You hear me? So if we look then at the reasons for the African in America holding the revolutionary card, it's in part because of what makes this culture up. And it's more than I said. I'm listing some of it. This is the most complex culture on the planet, and in part because we're coming out of the most complex conditions. So when we look at this then, what's important to understand about the African in America is that the African in America will not move to take action on a collective level unless you've got a mix of two elements. One element is spirit. It better be up in there. The vibratory forces that move you, that, as Julian Richardson said, makes you tap your feet. If the movement ain't making you tap your feet, you ain't moving. That's why the Marxists haven't been able to get to anything other than intellectuals among us, because the masses of people have to have that feeling and that vibe better be right. And that comes from the spirit. And then it's got to be a mixture of spirit and matter. And it's got to be those things that will produce change, to improve your condition in the world. And one of the features of this new African culture that's extremely important that we draw from, and we invented it, and the African and the Caribbean invented it, and that's Pan-Africanism, one Africa. That's an important ingredient, very, very important. So Amilcar Cabral correctly asserted that the liberation movement's an act of culture. You see him on the side there with the sunglasses. The liberation movement is an act of culture. And culture is buried for all people deep inside of them, for African people in the souls, as Du Bois said, of Black folks. And so a lot of it's subliminal, meaning it's deep down inside of you, you ain't even conscious of it. Cabral made that observation. He made the observation that most liberation movements are not conscious of just how much they draw on their own culture. So when you look at the Russian Revolution, for example, so-called revolution, the people who end up in charge, they end up behaving just like the czars, except worse, because they had the technology to really kill. Stalin was lucky he had any generals left. He had killed so many of them, killed off all the revolutionaries. What kind of revolutionary kills off revolutionaries? What kind of crap is this? You call this a revolution? Huh? And in the case of the Chinese Revolution, when Mao Zedong comes to power, and it's a different kind of revolution because they're not coming from European culture, they're coming from Confucianism. When you look at Mao, in the end, outside they were calling him Chairman Mao, all the rest of it. That's not what they called him in China. He was Emperor Mao. Now, the Chinese were aware of that, but there were a whole lot of other features in their culture that's residual, that's hidden. It's in the subconscious. It's in their souls. And that's true with us as well. All I can say with the African in America, if you want to move that African in America, you better have a dose of Africa in it. And it better be in a new African form. I'm into Ifa, the Yoruba spirit system. But I'm not solely in that, but I am especially into that. A great priest, Araba Babalao Ifeyemi. Great diviner. But I've always told him, if you want to get Ifa moving in the United States, then it better move the way the spirit moves here. You're going to have to raise them up. Now, they do that for the Yoruba, and that's mixed into our stuff here, but it better be mixed up in an ingredient that will move us, because there's got to be some real vibratory forces in that. You know what I mean? Beautiful forces. And that's what moves us. So it's important to note that what was labeled as the civil rights movement by the white media was named by Black folks the Black freedom movement. Why? Because freedom is a fundamental principle of our culture. Fighting for civil rights, what does that mean? The average Black person doesn't even know what that means. Civil rights could mean the right to vote and stuff like that, and people wanted that. But they called that freedom. That was a part of freedom. It wasn't the whole of it, but it was a part of it. And that's how they defined it. And they did it, as King said, how amazing it was that people could get together and come out of their souls and come up with new strategies and new stuff. He said, based on freedom and discipline. That's the definition of improvisation. And it improvisation is so central to us and innovation is so central to us that some of us take it for granted because it's just natural. And some of us don't even give ourselves credit for what that means in terms of our creative powers. And that's been the key for us to win, being creative. So freedom has been the key thing in our movement. And as I pointed out before, the national anthem of the spiritual blues, and the spiritual blues, which is the spirituals, but the blues. It's incorrect to call them just the spiritual. They're the spiritual blues because it's sacred and secular united, with the sacred transcending. And Jesus ain't in it for the most part because blacks were not Christians at that point. So when you're looking at the spiritual blues, then what you're looking at is it is an art form because all of the African American art form springs from this. It is an art form of freedom. Anytime in the spiritual blues you're talking about heaven, in most cases that's a code word for freedom. That's a route that you're going to take under the Underground Railroad. It's a way in which we're going to organize a resistance movement. It could be a slave revolt or whatever. You know, it was coded. It was never stated in public. And it was this inspiration of freedom in the new African form based on improvisation and discipline that General Nat Turner was inspired by the Spirit, and Sister Harriet Tubman, and many others. And so the song, "Oh Freedom," that I played before, "Oh Freedom over me, before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free," that was the hallmark of the liberation movements and enslavement. That was the hallmark of the Black freedom movement. It was a singing movement. Because again, if you draw from spirit, you draw from beauty. So this mighty movement, all of these movements have been an expression of African or New African culture created by field blacks. This is the key point. European culture, if you're going to deal with their art form, it's aristocratic. It puts the average white person to sleep. And of course, if it's in French or Italian or something else, they don't even know what they're saying. But the African American culture recreated here and its art form came from everyday people, the people in the most oppressed condition, field slaves. And why? They were the most African among us. To this day, that's the case. That's why hip hop would come up the way it came up, you know, from the projects in the streets. You hear me? Reggae, you know, the same thing when we're talking about the art form. In the streets, they call it in the dirt in Jamaica, you know, Trench Town, and places like that. Everyday people who are the most African among us, the most caring and most feeling among us. And some can be the most messed up among us. I'm not romanticizing this stuff, you know what I mean? But generally, our best people, because that's all we've had to survive here. You know, land. We didn't have, you know, any kind of government program for anything. We had to do this ourselves. And it was us looking after us that put us in that position. And so these Black freedom, Black power, Pan-Africanist movements, these are Black-led movements. And by the way, as one slave narrative said, and it's the ones that are hardly ever said, you know, these were narratives done during the Depression where people went in and interviewed people in the 30s and, you know, and one formerly enslaved African said this: "Only the Blacks can lead the Blacks." And if you know our people, you'll know there's been no major mass movement led by anybody white or any other ethnicity. It's been us. It's been us. And that makes it a Black nationalist movement. I'm going to say this also about the distinction between Black nationalism expressed by intellectuals and Black nationalism expressed by the grassroots. And this can also apply to revolutionary Black nationalism. The grassroots is not ideological. The grassroots is not theory oriented. They are very practical. They're practice oriented. And so they're not going to elaborate on elaborate theories. It's the intellectuals who do that. And so, for example, with grassroots Black nationalism, they're usually not talking about a nation state. In the US, now in the Caribbean, they would. In Africa, they would. And why is that? Because they can't see it. See, in Africa or the Caribbean, where you're a majority, you can see how a struggle can move to where you'll have your own government. You know, state are those instruments, you know, a government, parliament, whatever you call it, an economic system, a military system, which oftentimes you don't need unless you've got an enemy that you need to arm yourself against. Too often these military systems have been used against our people. So in the Caribbean, in Africa, a Garvey could come here even under colonialism and think like the head of a nation because he could see it. He could see that this 98% or 97% Black island will eventually rule itself. The African in America is in a different position. So they're practical. And when they get together and move on something, they can see a way to win. That's the thing with the grassroots. Huh? And if you want to understand grassroots Black nationalism, understand the Black family. Because basically social structure drives everything. Drives your philosophy, drives everything. The foundation of social structure is your family. Up until recently, Black families were 97% Black. 97% of Black men married Black women for over 100 years. And now it's 92% of sisters marry brothers and 86% of brothers marry sisters. And it's only 29% married because people can't afford to be married now. But they have other relationships. But that's Black nationalism. We have more unity when it comes to the issues that affect us than any other group. 97% of white people have never agreed on anything. And that's one of the first things you need to know when you're waging power. It ain't always easy, pardon my English, to get us to do 97% either. The Montgomery bus boycott, 97% of the people supported it. It ain't easy. I'm not suggesting we just pop up here at 97%. Not with all these creative Black folks, everybody wanting to have a say-so. But then, because truth and what's right is going to be the basis for the light, that's what will get us to fall in line. And generally, that's what we end up doing. So then if we're looking at why is it that the African in America has cornered revolutionary thought and action and have been the leaders of that, it's because of this culture and also our position in this society. And it is because, particularly in this deep well of culture, creativity has been real key to us producing the victories in Montgomery, the Montgomery bus boycott, the student sit-ins, the freedom rides, Birmingham, Selma, the victorious San Francisco freedom movement, Black Power, the Black Panther Party, Pan-Africanism, and Afrocentrism. This creativity has been at the key of that we have been able to forge movements. and in many cases, successful ones. They haven't always been successful. But even putting the movements together, that's been a success. And some movements that may have been beaten down because the state came after them real hard, their impact on the world has still been profound. And I would argue, had they done a better job of strategizing, they could have avoided being beaten down, by the way, you know. So those in the movement who advance from reformism or making improvements in the system, such as gaining the right to vote, ending legal apartheid, getting jobs, getting housing for blacks, and moved from that to a realization that racism, capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism, and indirect economic control or neocolonialism that's made the rich rich and the poor poor. Those who have reached the conclusion that this is the heart of the problem, they have embraced an idea that reform may be the first step, but it's going to take a radical transformation of a system that is very crooked to produce justice. And so it's led some who are always a minority to embrace revolutionary nationalism. And by the way, whites don't like the term revolutionary black nationalism because they equate it with revolutionary white nationalism, you know? But then you got to explain something. Are you going to tell me that the Haitian Revolution wasn't revolutionary because Marx wasn't around yet and hadn't defined what a socialist revolution should be? Huh? That's the greatest slave insurrection in the history of the world, and it was revolutionary, especially under Dessalines, who wanted to equitably distribute the wealth, the land. That's why they killed him. But it was revolutionary because African men and women, under the maroon tradition of African resistance, defeated the French, defeated the Spanish, defeated the British. The only time in the history of the world, those are the baddest Africans in the Western Hemisphere, maybe in the world, and they deserve our support. We should be organizing ways to pressure the United States to get the hell out of Haiti and let the Haitians run their own stuff, because all America's been doing is propping up crooks, arming them, and then killing people. And you're seeing right now where they're trying to march in the some Africans to police the Haitians, Kenyans, and they've been resistant to it. And that's been a United States move. You understand? And that's been true of both parties. They pulled this same mess. Why? Because they don't like black power. I understand that. I understand that. But the fact is, whether you like it or not, we're in the position to produce some change on that. And there's a lot of strugglers in this country struggling around Haiti. And we need to build more support so that we can get the backs of the United States and the Western world off their backs so they can do their own thing. So a minority of our people have reached a revolutionary standpoint where they see that the system itself needs to be changed from top to bottom. Malcolm X described the power of this group, and it was correct the way he defined it. He said the revolutionary is like the fuse on a stick of dynamite. It's the smallest part. But if you light it, everything else explodes. You understand? That's the nature of the revolutionary when it goes into action. And that's why I say a Black Panther Party that only numbered maybe 6,000 people nationally had the hearts of a whole lot of Black people. Why? Because they were standing up for the truth. And the people knew it. And it took the young who had the courage to go and join it. but there was a lot more support for it than was manifested in its membership, because it was the fuse on the stick of dynamite, you know. And they were bad and bold. So what lit the fuse of those who became revolutionaries? This is the real question. In the making of Black revolutionaries, what is it that went into the make up of them? What is it that transformed them? Because you didn't just come out of the womb saying, Mama, this is a no good for nothing system, and let's take it out. In fact, your mother probably slapped you upside your head, but you wouldn't even think of doing that. You know what I mean? So, what are the ingredients that produce this thing called a Black revolutionary? One of my students called me a perpetual activist. And you could add to that a perpetual revolutionary. So what is that? The first thing I think that is really important, and this is true also for people who are engaged in struggle to produce change, even if it isn't revolutionary, but to improve the lives of our people. These are truth seekers. The first thing that is really key to any kind of change, reform, or revolution, is that you be dedicated to the truth. And this is the real key thing, which today we call ma'at. But we didn't need the word ma'at to know what that was, because that's basically what almost all Black mothers and fathers taught their children. Tell the truth. Be a good person. That's the thing that parents would point to as the most important thing. So, a common feature of the revolutionary is a truth seeker. And this is true both for the reformist and the revolutionary, but especially the revolutionary. The classroom where you learn the truth is the battlefield for Black liberation or African liberation, or for any other people in the world, their battlefield. It's a gigantic classroom. And who are the teachers? Your enemies. They're among your best teachers. Because if you don't know them, they'll whip you. But if you do, you've got a chance of winning. Your people are primary teachers. And we often think of our people as the great people. Yeah, they're important. But generally, in the course of a movement, it's everyday people who are pulling your coat and dropping wisdom in your ear. They are the main ones that open your eyes up. I was brought into the movement by a sister named Ella Hill Hutch. I've referred to this before, mother of the San Francisco Freedom Movement. She was a receptionist for the Longshoremen's Union, International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union, that my father belonged to. She was an everyday sister. She later became prominent, first Black woman elected to the Board of Supervisors. But the fact is, she was an everyday person. My mother's best friend. She's the one that got me in the movement. You know what I mean? Everyday people are the major teachers in a movement. Also, what's the learning thing that produces revolutionaries? One of them is victories. Now, that's a real good teacher. But defeats, losses, teach you even more. King's greatest victory was Birmingham. He came upon that through the movement that preceded it, where he had made some serious mistakes. And it wasn't just his mistakes, it was the mistakes of people who brought him into the movement. And so from the mistakes, they began to come up with answers. And those answers produced his biggest victory in terms of the organization of it. So we learn from our mistakes. And then, of course, it's our culture that is the big teacher. And it is the culture that is inspiring us everywhere we go. So when we look at, so what are the ingredients that make a revolutionary? If we look at the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, we've had a couple of shows preceding the last one on King. And one was his connection with African leaders, which is generally unknown. And we had Menu Ampin on, and he's the foremost authority on King, wrote a master's thesis on the revolutionary Martin Luther King. It's the best piece on King written by anybody. And he was talking about those things that inspired King to move from a reformist to a revolutionary. And one of the things he was showing was that as he was going through the transformation, Africa was on his mind. That from the earliest stage, he was engaged in dialogue with African leaders. And he, the second show on that was a speech that King delivered about his attendance in Ghana's independence ceremony that was generally lost. And a brother named Mickey Dean was an attorney coming out of Kansas City, Missouri, member of the National Black United Front, forwarded that to me, and I gave him notice, credit for having coming up with this. And not very many people have watched that. My goodness, why wouldn't you? You understand? Because the stereotype of King was he was an integrationist, which is as far from the truth as possible. So if we look at King, his transformation from a reformist who was producing some change in the system, which he said the changes they produced were cheap because to give people the right to vote didn't cost any money. But when he said we're moving from reform to revolution, then he knew this was going to cost some money, among other things. But he also knew that it would require a restructuring of the society, which is what King came to conclude needed to be done. So the key things about King is he was sincere when he joined the movement. He was pulled into the movement. Even the meeting at his church that laid out the strategy for the Montgomery bus boycott, he didn't plan that. It was E.D. Nixon, who was head of the NAACP, that pulled that together. And he did not offer himself to be leader. He was reluctant to assume leadership. And it's only over time that, as Menu Ampin, anyone who studied King knows, that he began to assume the burden, because it was a hell of a burden. A lot of people see this, oh, this is a great thing. I wish I would do that. Yeah, really? So as a sincere maximum spokesperson for the Southern Black Freedom Movement, the key thing about King is he learned from his experiences. And as Manu pointed out, King was very practical, as our people are. It's a product of African American culture. So he supported armed struggles in Africa, in Asia, throughout the world, where it was feasible, where they could win. He didn't call for it here because he didn't see how you could win, So again, he was practical. But the key thing is he listened. He was a learner. And as a result of that, when you listen and learn, you grow. And that was the key thing about King. He was sincere and he was open to new ideas. He wrote 5 books, as was pointed out in the interview that we had. And these books each spoke to the stage of the struggle. And so he was telling you where things were going and raising questions about how to get there. And how did he have the time to write 5 books when he's on the road organizing 24/7 for years? So the key thing is King understood the connection between the Black freedom movement in the U.S. and the movement for liberation in Africa and in other parts of the world. But he understood the value of Pan-Africanism. I noted in that show that after King left the independence ceremony in Ghana, he stopped in London to meet with C.L.R. James. C.L.R. James, one of the fathers of Pan-Africanism, the man who came up with the idea for organizing the Sixth Pan-African Congress, the person who introduced Kwame Nkrumah to Malcolm Nurse or George Padmore. This was a father, one of the fathers of Pan-Africanism, and wrote one of the outstanding books on the Haitian Revolution, Black Jacobins. Stayed in my house, as I pointed out before, and I'll show you a picture today of him for a week for African Liberation Day in 1977, where I benefited a lot from learning from him, a wonderful human being. So King strategizing was one of the best thinkers on Pan-Africanism. You heard about that before? So you could not separate King's radicalization on domestic issues from the radicalization around international issues. And of course, we know about the ultimate stand he took on Vietnam, but he was taking that stand much earlier, and he was supporting Malcolm in his demands for the U.S. to get their hands off of the Congo. He supported Malcolm on that. So King, like Malcolm, came to see that the Black movement for liberation in the U.S. and the African liberation movement were anti-colonial. King called it a case of domestic colonialism. While both movements share common features, that is, the movements in Africa for liberation, or the Caribbean for that matter, and the movements for liberation here, there are certain common features. One is systemic underdevelopment. This is a system that is set up to keep us on the bottom on every level. So underdevelopment is a key feature. If you're looking at the health indicators for Blacks in this country, again, they're the same kind of health indicators that you find in underdeveloped countries with a lower life expectancy, with high levels of illness. And I don't know how many of you know that Black colleges, I think most of you know that Black colleges produce the majority of our technical people, engineers, architects, doctors, things like that. But at this point, when it comes to the medical profession, Blacks make up 6% of the medical profession, and yet we're 12% of the population. Why is that? A major reason is a number of Black medical schools were decertified by racist whites because they didn't want Blacks to have doctors who could take care of their own medical care. Huh? That is similar to what is done in colonies, you know? And we know that you can get a high school education if you're white and get a job that pays what a Black person with a college education gets. Huh? So that's all a part of what maintains underdevelopment. And then excluding us from owning homes for a long time. It meant that the basis for wealth of the average person is the equity in a house. And for a long time, we haven't had any. And then any homes. And then when a lot of Blacks started getting homes prior to the 2008 period, these are on lousy mortgages. And when the economy collapses, Blacks lose 40% of their housing, which Obama did nothing to try and save them from. But he saved the corporations that caused the problem. So as a sincere maximum spokesperson for the Southern Black freedom movement, King had learned from these same experiences and treated these as colonial, calling it a case of domestic colonialism. But in fact, while the Native American is under domestic colonialism, because domestic colonialism is a situation where people have a land mass, a nation, or in this case, nations of people had this land mass, Native Americans, and then another people come in and they want to take it and they want to live there. That's called settler colonialism or domestic colonialism. What is the usual methodology used there? It is a methodology of genocide. And so 90% of the Native Americans were wiped out that way. So Native Americans bear the relationship to the United States of a domestic colony. But if you want to be precise, the African in America shares certain qualities of a colony, but they didn't come to our land that is in the United States and take the land from us. They took us away from the land. And then they went on the land of Africa and either colonized it domestically or very often under a colonial system where a minority of whites maintained power through arms, arming also a sector of African people under their control as well as their own. So this is not a case where we're sitting on our land and we're dispossessed. We were brought to this land. And so we share certain elements of colonialism, but there are features of colonialism that we don't share. Ours has not been a case where we've been sitting on our land struggling to gain independence for our people, even though some have called for it. The Republic of New Africa and other parties have called for that. And that could happen, could happen in the future. I'm not ruling it out. If so, it would probably be in the southern part of the United States. But that has not been the nature of the condition of our people's struggles today. So while we have elements of colonialism making us a semi-colony, the biggest difference between the African struggle for liberation in the US and the African struggle for liberation in Africa and the Caribbean, and the reason that this struggle here is so threatening, Malcolm concluded by the end of his life, the most threatening theater for African liberation in the world, even more threatening than in Africa, and that's in his speech, The Last Message. Go read it. What makes us special and unique and also contributes to our power is the fact that we threaten white power at its base because we are located in the heart of this power. We are strategically located inside the headquarters of the house of the most decadent, racist, declining power in the world. We're here. And that is what distinguishes us from the African in the Caribbean or the African on the African continent. And while we're not the majority in this house, our location is strategic. First, because of the culture that I've already discussed, but because we're on the inside of the house and we have the ability to rearrange the furniture. In fact, we have the ability to throw the furniture out, bring in new furniture. We have the ability to tear it down and reconstruct it because we're on the inside. We're in the best position to do this because we don't own the furniture. We don't have a stake in the furniture. And it's our culture that gives us a qualitatively different vision of what we can do inside this house. Menu Ampin, Ampin, Ampin. And his book, his manuscript is The Revolutionary Martin Luther King. You can't get it because it's his master's thesis, but hopefully he said he's going to eventually, Ampin, Ampin, N. He plans to eventually publish this book. So it's our strategic position inside this house that puts us in a position to really produce change. So King talked about restructuring the society. You're in a position where you can play a leading role in that, given the leading position that revolutionary Black nationalism plays and revolutionary Pan-Africanism plays. And so our strategic location inside the U.S. House and the beauty of our culture centered on freedom is the force that inspires others within this house to follow our lead. And that's the nature of it. But some of you are in the position of, well, ain't nobody else going to help us. We're all alone. Yeah, we were definitely virtually all alone in slavery, though we had an underground railroad that provided some allies. And yes, when we kick a movement off, it starts with us. But because of our strategic location, the complexity and beauty of our culture, this culture and this strategic location enables us to create chain reactions. And I'm talking political, but it's also artistic. It's on every level, but especially political, because that's where power is. So can I prove it? I've discussed this before, but I'm putting this in a different context. The context of revolution. So it was the Garvey movement that couldn't get off the ground in Jamaica, but got off the ground in the United States, where Blacks were facing a terrorism that the Jamaicans hadn't faced since slavery. It was the Garvey movement, headquartered in the United States, that created a chain reaction that inspired the Vietnamese leader, Ho Chi Minh, to go back to Vietnam to lead the liberation movement for freedom against the French, against the Japanese, against the Americans. And he said so. And when Kwame Ture went to visit him, he asked him, I said this before in a previous show, what's your black butt doing here? You should be in Africa, helping to free the Africans. And when those brainwashed Black soldiers got out in the field to shoot at Vietnamese, they would say, and I talked to a brother who was one of those brainwashed ones. He was a captain in the Marine Corps, and he's in a ditch, a trench. And the Vietnamese are blasting information that America would call propaganda. And said, American Negro, why you fight us? We the same color. And see, Ho Chi Minh spent time in the United States. He attended Garvey's meeting. He knew about, American system of racism, the Klan and everything else. And they said, American Negro, you fight us for America, but you go back home and you can't buy a house in a white neighborhood. That brother said, when he went back home, so-called the United Snakes of America, he couldn't buy a house in a white neighborhood. And Ho Chi Minh helped wake him up. We helped wake Ho Chi Minh up. Ho Chi Minh helped wake us up. Because that Vietnamese revolution created chain reactions, So it's our strategic position. But if you don't have a sense of power, you'll say, you ain't got any. You know what I mean? Woe is me. You got the post-traumatic blues. And I'm not denying that there's some of that carryover, but I mean, come on. You know what I mean? So Students for Democratic Society, SDS, Their organizing was inspired by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, chain reaction, strategic position. Cesar Chavez, who was the Mexican American leader for the farm workers, was inspired by the Black Freedom Movement, especially by Martin Luther King, and used a lot of the strategies that King used. The San Francisco Freedom Movement, that I was privileged to be maximum but not sole leader of, inspired the white-led UC Berkeley free speech movement, radicalized them. The Black Panther Party inspired the Chicano Brown Berets, the Puerto Rican Young Lords, the Native American Indian movement, and the underground of SDS, the Weather Underground, that sprang free Assata Shakur, one of the baddest sisters that's walked the planet. You hear me? The Congress would love to come up with $1 million to stick in somebody's pocket to get them to bring her back, to charge her with a murder she never committed. So you're in that position, but you run around acting like you're powerless. Depose presidents, force your agenda on them, and produce some real significant change, and that change is based on your power. So let's look at how Ella Baker was radicalized, who is on this promotional, One Beautiful Sister. One of the two best organizers of the 60s, Malcolm and her, you know. Now, the key thing about Ella Baker, Miss Ella Baker, as she was called in the movement, who was a straight A student, valedictorian of both her high school and college graduation classes. She came out of the best features of New African culture, the very best. Her grandfather and grandmother had been enslaved Africans. Her grandmother was the product of house slave. That is, the slave master was the father of her grandmother, and her mother was Black. This woman was imbued with Black pride, because not all house slaves were of the type that Malcolm depicted as those who loved the master. And so when her so-called father, enslaver, told her he wanted her to marry another light-skinned house slave, she said no. And they stuck her in the field. And then she found the blackest minded, blackest colored, smartest, bravest Black man and married him. Ella Baker was born with Black pride surrounding her from head to toe. That was Ella Baker. Her grandfather bought him some land, and that was the key to that family having any kind of independence. And then he would use the land when poor people in the community didn't have enough to eat. He'd mortgage it, give them the food, and then pay off the mortgage. Ella Baker was not only raised on race pride, she was raised on communalism, which is another principle. I didn't discuss it, but it is a key principle of African American or New African culture, where the land, air, and water is shared but not owned. But you couldn't do that in the United States, because everything's privately owned, including you, if it was slavery. But the fact is, what happens is with Africans in America, it's the communal ethos that kept us going, the sharing of life, food being one, love being key, nurturing you, giving you a roof over the head when you didn't have one. On the plantation, that was the sharing that kept you alive. When your family had been sold out from under you, the new family took care of you. That communal ethos was key. And so this was something that Ella Baker carried to every movement that she was involved in. She always had an economic support thing for movements, you know. When some of them were being boycotted, in the South and Mississippi and other things. It was Ella Baker that saw that money was raised for them, support was raised for them, you know. So she had the communal ethos that she came out of. And she had this idea of race consciousness, as you know, that her job was to be in support of everyday Black folks. Her mother and father were into working in ways to support their people, but and particularly her grandfather, they believed that it took the better off Blacks to elevate those who were poor. Ella didn't believe that. Ella believed that the people themselves should lead themselves and definitely have the capacity to. But she drew on these powerful principles, and spirit was a key component of that. Ella Baker was a member of a Black church the whole time she was in SNCC, but religion was never a part of her politics. Spirit was, and it was part of what made her the strong, dignified woman that she was. Ella Baker was an opponent of capitalism, of racism, and imperialism. And Ella Baker, while the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was nonviolent, Ella Baker was not. When she was a young girl, the sheriff's son called her the N-word and she knocked him out. And the family encouraged her in what she did. They didn't say, oh, don't do that. They could kill you, blah, blah. You know what I mean? That was Ella Baker. She supported Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but I know, given her Southern experience, she knew that nonviolence was not practical, and it was not a part of her spirit. So what Ella Baker attempted to do throughout her life was to take the culture that she had lived up under in North Carolina and carry it into the movement. So she was truly an expression of the best features of African American culture, and it contributed to her revolutionary consciousness. She was opposed to the war in Vietnam. She was supportive of African independence movements, and her initial ambition was to become a medical doctor who would work in Africa. And fortunately for us, unfortunately for her, she didn't have the money to go to medical school, and that kept her here in the Black liberation movement. You know, so Ella Baker, one of the best expressions of revolutionary Black nationalism. Now, would she have called herself a Black nationalist? Probably not. But if you look at the cultural principles that drove her, those were all African American cultural principles. Here's the key thing, and this is because she's one of the people that I feature in the book I'm finishing on teaching or pedagogy. Ella Baker was a special kind of revolutionary thinker. I call her a situational revolutionary. She did not lay out prescriptions the way a European thinker would. Chapters in a book on this theory, that theory, and the other. No. She had ideas for how Blacks could produce fundamental change in their lives, in their communities, in their families, in their organizations, and in the society at large, based on situations. What does that mean? See, Ella Baker comes out of a tradition where knowing and being are not separate. To know something, you've got to be that. And so the prescriptions she was giving for change were prescriptions that applied to people's lives, prescriptions that she practiced. And it made it very hard for the system to figure her out and nail her down and then just come after her or predict what she was going to do next. Because basically, African American and African culture is situational. The philosophy deals with addressing situations in life. So this was a special, unique quality of Miss Ella Baker. Malcolm X, in his trajectory from backwardness, I wouldn't even say reform, to revolutionary, first of all, to Black nationalism, and then revolutionary Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism. I pointed this out before. I just say that in the beginning, he was a confused rebel who, in his young years, reacted to racism by rebelling in a confused way, in ways that actually conformed to the system. So he ended up hustling. He ended up petty crime. He exaggerated his criminal credentials, but he had some. And so that's where he starts off. He started off with a Garveyite family, but as that family is broken up, his father dies, his mother had a nervous breakdown that Malcolm misinterpreted as mental illness. So the essence of Malcolm was family. The essence of everybody ain't family. Family's important for some more than others, but some people, their worldview is based on family. My brother was like that. Malcolm was like that. They view everything through the lens of family. And so when Malcolm's family was disrupted, lost his father, and his mother eventually just tired out by the harassment of the system, is put in an insane asylum when she just had a nervous breakdown. She needed a little rest. That's all she needed. And ended up in there for over 20 years. And so Malcolm no longer has what he needed more than any other member of his family support, because the whole family experienced what Malcolm did, but none of them went and did what Malcolm did. They stuck true to the Garvey teachings of their mother and father. But Malcolm was finding family in the worst places. And so this was his trajectory that would lead later to revolutionary consciousness. Because again, you learn from your mistakes if you learn. And everything we do ain't pretty. We make mistakes. And so it's Malcolm's family that woke him up. See, people don't give the family enough credit. They were the first to really actively rebuild the Nation of Islam. It was Malcolm's oldest brother, Wilford. And Wilford is the one that guided his siblings to fish him in. They fished Malcolm before he became a good fisherman, that is, organizer. And it was Reginald, if you read the autobiography, that did that. But Reginald, who was in the Nation of Islam as the rest of the family, was sent by Wilford, because he knew Malcolm wasn't going to listen to him. But Wilford, Reginald, and Malcolm had lived together. They knew each other. And Reginald knew how to play him. He knew how to play on his street psychology. So Malcolm's transformation begins with his awakening in prison, and reading is the key to that. And it leads to a freedom of his mind, even though he's confined. And that's what he said. And he went through the sixfold stages of mental freedom. One that I didn't know that he had gone through, because I underwent that transformation in 1963, and we didn't know about Malcolm's transformation until the autobiography was published around 1965. So this is an organic transformation process that Cabral went through and others. In the NOI, Nation of Islam, he's drawn to it because Elijah Muhammad's a father figure. And in the nation, Malcolm is able to build the nation in part based on the subliminal appeal of Africa. That was his observation, that when you got deep down into the African, in America, you touched Africa. And so it was the appeals that he made around African history and African culture that was particularly appealing. And his attack on self hatred and loving white and hating black, something that Malcolm had gone through. And so Malcolm, inside the nation, while he appealed to the subliminal African instincts of Africa, he kind of didn't go deep into Africa, that is Pan Africanism, because Elijah Muhammad didn't like Africa. So we talk about the Bandung Conference. It's when Malcolm is forced out of the nation that he deeply gets involved in Africa, though he had been studying it and forming relationships with African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and others all along. And so it is with his forced removal from the Nation of Islam that Malcolm begins to really swim in the waters of Pan-Africanism. Most of his time after his forced removal from the Nation of Islam was in Africa. And so a lot of his growth, which was rapid, came out of what he was learning on the African continent through Pan-Africanism, and also the lessons he had learned and was learning from the Black Freedom Movement, because his overall strategy was to internationalize the Black Freedom Movement and charge America with violating human rights. That was his strategy. And he was taking the Black Freedom Movement internationally and putting it on another level. That was his strategy. And one of the things that began to happen as Malcolm traveled throughout Africa, he began to change his views on Garveyism, and he began to change his views or have a deeper critique of capitalism. And I think one of the African leaders that he was exposed to that had the most influence on him on that was President Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. He met with Nkrumah, he met with many other African leaders, but he could see on the ground Nyerere, president of Tanzania, was drawing on African culture, ujamaa, which means familyhood, to rebuild Tanzania. He had the best program for rebuilding Africa of any African leader. So again, what shaped Malcolm into a revolutionary? I would say, first of all, he had a profile that was a natural revolutionary, but it got misled. But when he finally embraced it, it was the study, it was the internal self-examination, it was his involvement in organizing Black people as a spokesperson for the Nation of Islam, and then his engagement with the Black Freedom Movement, both in and out of the Nation of Islam, and especially Pan-Africanism, that gave him the understanding of what needed to be done. And by the end of his life, he was talking about how crooked capitalism was, comparing it to a chicken laying a duck egg, saying if a chicken could lay a duck egg, it would be a revolutionary chicken. And if you could produce change in America, it would be a revolutionary system. And so through his parables and symbols, he's doing that. I want to come finally to myself, and I'm going to use some illustrations here for that. My own transformation. I've always been fortunate to have great African women in my life, and my first one, Anasa Tashaka, who did a lot of work for our people. And this lady here, this is our wedding. You see this when you see the introduction to the show. We had an African wedding that's inside our house, and we had our special friends come for that. She's been a real joy in my life, and I'm so glad that she survived something that was really rough. Um, so what I'm going to do here is just review some of the things that have been key in my own transformation, and particularly look at the transformation um, both through my awakening that occurs in the course of the Black Freedom Movement, and those things that lead to my radicalization and my embracing of Pan-Africanism and the work around Pan-Africanism that helped to deepen a radical perspective. So the first thing for me was that the Black Freedom Movement was the classroom that introduced me to what those things that changed my life, to my purpose, to our people's culture. And after undergoing an awakening similar to Malcolm's, and I knew nothing about his at the time, then led me into a deep dive into our culture. I decided to wear this outfit that I have on here, which is Dogon clothing, because it was the Dogon culture that had the greatest influence in it from Africa on me. Because I picked the Dogon because it was a living culture that had not been changed fundamentally by colonialism. So it played a big role, along with understanding the features of African American culture that are African. Those two played a big role in waking me up once I underwent an awakening and began to think for myself. Now, King's radicalization came after his successes in the Southern Freedom Movement. My radicalization came as a result of our successes in the Black Freedom Movement in San Francisco. And the beginning of that radicalization came in two ways: one through experience, the other through study. The experience was that as successful as we were in producing thousands of jobs for Blacks, I came to realize that the system of capitalism, the way it's run, will not provide the jobs, the economic conditions that will improve the lives of the majority of our people. That capitalism is designed to make the rich rich and the poor poor, and Blacks would be on the bottom no matter how much we reform this system. That was the beginning of the realization. I could have sat on the victories and I could have said, oh, this is wonderful, and go back into the system and live a comfortable life. But I was following the truth, and the truth was telling me this system of capitalism is no good. And of course, this system of racism is no good. And so the few of us that might get something, that's not the status of the majority of our people. And it was a concern. King had this concern, Malcolm did, Ella Baker, I did, and many others. My main concern is for the poorest of us, the ones who are on the bottom. I care about everybody, that is all of our people, and I care about humanity. But I care about those on the bottom most, you know. And they're the ones that our power rests on, our creativity rests on, and they're the creators of our culture. The first real influences on me in terms of consciousness, Black consciousness, even though I got put to sleep in a certain set of ways later, was my father, my mother, and my grandmother. My father, who I pointed out in previous shows, was a natural revolutionary, fighting the Klan when he was 12 years old, refusing to fight in World War II. He was a walking war machine, one man. Brass knuckles were his main weapon for settling differences. And he got the legal right to do that because he had three fears. One of them was jail. the other was hospitals, and the other was airplanes. He had no fear of white people, but those three. So he got himself, as I pointed out before, a job as a bouncer in a Chinese nightclub called the Forbidden City. And he got the legal right to kick the behinds of whites who were out of line. He wasn't going to go to jail for that. He had two jobs. The longshoreman job was one of the best jobs blacks could get. He didn't need a second job. That second job was for psychological relief. He'd come home telling us war stories about some guy who used the N-word, knocked him out, and then breathed fire on him. I'm one of them, buddy. You know what I mean? So from my father, he was very light complexion and very proud of being black. And don't you insult black people. You hear me? That was my father. Black pride to the extreme. And he was a lover. That is, he loved us. He loved my mother. He was a loving man, but a fierce one you didn't want to cross. And then it was my grandmother, black as midnight and proud of every inch of her blackness and loving and kind. And I have two sources of womanhood, my mother and my grandmother. My first wife was a mirror image of my grandmother. My second wife is a mirror image of my mother. My mother looked like Lena Horne. My wife said she's prettier, very pretty, straight A student, very smart, and possessed of natural pride. Her friends called her queen, and she supported all of her children as my father did in our endeavors in life. And so this was a woman of great pride. And when we went to school, we were at least 2 to 3 years ahead, because what she taught us, well, you'd have to go 3 grades to get it. That was my mother. So these were major influences on me. And it affected my sense of pride. I've never had a sense of low self-esteem. I've never had that. In part, that's due to my parents and my grandmother. In part, it's intrinsic to me. My mother said, I pointed this out on a previous show, she did a book on my, a year of my life when I was born. She didn't do it for my brother and sister because her hands were full when she had a second and third child. And so one day she gave me a mirror, and I looked at the mirror and I laughed. I liked myself. There's never been a problem with that. So I never had that problem. Malcolm had the problem of not liking black. I never had that problem. I had some brainwashing that I had to overcome. My mind was put on remote control. I had bought into their definition of history. And so a lot of things that I thought was true wasn't. That's where my awakening came from. And I own it. My father was trying to tell me different, but it went over my head. It took Norman Brown, a brother from the same city that Zora Neale Hurston was born in, the first all-black city in the United States, to wake me up. So that's where my awakening comes from. And then I was getting close to my father, because in many ways he was like Malcolm. He was just the individual version of Malcolm X. So the other influences on me was the Montgomery bus boycott and the Cuban Revolution. And those I saw as being very important. In terms of African history, the thing that began to, along with me seeing that capitalism would not provide for the majority of our people or for any people a good life, was in the reading of the first book I read on African history. I read about Basil Johnson's book, Lost Cities of Africa, very good introductory book on African history. The thing that impressed me most in that book was the economic organization of Africa, that it was communal, that is, it was sharing of land, air, and water. And I began to see there was an alternative to this system. That was the beginning of me looking at that, but I could only see it because That's what we had practiced in the South and in the North, where we shared what we had. It wasn't that you could get land that you didn't have to, buy, but it was the sharing of those things of life that would sustain you. And so I could recognize this when I read Lost Cities of Africa. I could compare this to my grandmother, who has 3 eggs and is sharing one with somebody who's homeless. So this is key in terms of my own transformation. Study began to lead to transformation. But the biggest study was the study of Dogon philosophy and African American philosophy, along with apprenticing under Garvey and then Malcolm, who became, even though it was indirect apprenticeship, Garvey was dead right after I was born, a year after I was born. Malcolm I met once and died in 65. But they were both major influences on me. So that was part of the transformation. But it's been basically introspection, looking at myself and undergoing change. Now, there was an attempt on my part to lead a move to build Black power in CORE in 1965. I've discussed this once before on this show, where myself and my friend Dengani, who passed on recently, attended the National CORE Convention in Durham in 1965, and I ended up being put in charge of the Resolutions Committee. We came to that convention because we had completed the San Francisco Freedom Movement, and we wanted to transform CORE from its current state to the next stage, and it was Black nationalism. I was a Garveyite then, and so I was into self-reliance. And so we introduced 33 resolutions to transform CORE. This is in no book, by the way. James Farmer didn't include this in his own book on CORE. He was former executive director of CORE. And these call for restructuring CORE, getting rid of chapters that couldn't serve the people, um, making sure that they were grounded in grassroots organizing, and making them self-reliant. We took white money out of CORE, and I've never taken a dime for any struggle I've led. And in part, I got that from Garvey. When we formed the National Black United Front, I had put in the Constitution a provision that it would be economically self-reliant. So they could not take any money from any foundation or anything else. Those were unanimously, except for one provision voting whites out of CORE, that couldn't be passed because you needed a year notice to do that. That happened later. So 32 of the 33 resolutions were unanimously adopted, and then James Farmer, got it reversed at a Central Committee meeting in New York by one vote. And so that was the end of me and CORE. And then I moved to take part and form a group called Pan-African People's Organization. And drawing from Garvey, we began to deal with institution building. We built the King Garvey cooperatives that I've talked about before, 220 units of housing. That was built by the executive committee of what became Pan-African People's Organization. So we began to engage in work, and the work that we engaged in was institution building, food programs that operated for 6 days a week for 2 years, 25 cents a meal, kept a lot of people alive, clothing, free clothing. We set up a school. We did a variety of things, 2-year plans, 5-year plans. I've talked about some of that before. And one of the things that we worked on was the support for the armed struggles in Africa. And that was around the African liberation movements in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, the struggles in Guinea-Bissau in Cape Verde and Southwest Africa. And so we were part of Pan-African Peoples Organization, led the major part on the West Coast, and was the biggest in the country after the first African Liberation Day in 1972. And after a sister named Belvie Brooks led this for a couple of years, then we took over African Liberation Day, averaging 29,000 to 30,000 people a year. And this is CLR James speaking at the 1977 African Liberation Day. So these mobilizations were very important because they provided the base for supporting African liberation movements, interacting with them, and also learning from them. And then we would later go to Africa and engage further in support for these struggles. Okay, let me see. These aren't in the order I'd like. So the first thing we did in 1973, we sent a work team to Tanzania, and these are pictures of this. I've talked about this in one of our shows before, but I want to show this in terms of how Pan-Africanism played a role in our development of our consciousness, and in this case, my own. So this is showing you on the upper left-hand corner members of our group working in an Ujaba village. And then you see on the second to the left, a brother with the big natural, Ajili Hodari, one of our leaders. And then to the right, you see me shaking hands, that's me, with a leader of the Southwest African Peoples Organization. The third from the bottom picture is Shirley Graham Du Bois, and the lady with the big natural is my first wife, Anasa Tashaka, myself, and another African American from Tanzania. So the key point was we were going to Tanzania to support their nation building effort because it was the best effort in terms of freeing Africa from colonialism. And Nyerere was using African culture, Ujamaa, which is sharing through the family, or what we would call communalism, as the base for rebuilding Tanzania. And it was a smart move because if you're going to rebuild a society that's undergone colonialism, you want to deal with economic development first, and that would be agricultural development first. And Nkrumah chose the path of industrialization first. But if you're going to really industrialize, you have to have a base where you're able to feed people and build up an economy. And so that's what was being done by Nyerere. And we were there to support it. So we were there for 3 months working in these villages. And everybody that went paid their own way. So this is another one that's kind of hard to see there, but the people on the bottom, they're also doing work. Sisters and brothers doing work in the villages. I lost 15 pounds doing this work. Then we were forging relationships with Tanzania and other African countries. So this is a reception that we had in our headquarters This is Garvey Hall. You see Garvey's picture in the back. Um, and it's the ambassador Paul Bomani, the ambassador from Tanzania to the United States. The person to the left who has African clothes on, that's Ella Hill Hutch, the sister that got me involved in the movement. And she would go to the Sixth Pan African Congress with Queen Mother Moore. And then you see me on the side with the goatee. Person I'm talking to is my wife. You can't see it because this thing that said slides is covering it, but the person whose head is facing the camera is my mother. And so we were forging relationships with African nations and at the same time learning lessons from them. And this is showing Nyerere, this is the president of Tanzania, working in the villages. He spent most of his time in the villages working with his people. And I think here they're teaching literacy. In 1974, a year after we worked in the Ujamaa villages, the Sixth Pan African Congress was called in Tanzania. The idea for this came from C.L.R. James. And C.L.R. James had talked to a brother named Paulu and suggested that he organize the Sixth Pan African Congress. Paulu he was a special kind of engineer that worked in rural villages in the South Pacific, in Africa, and the Caribbean. So he had contacts all over the world. And so Paulu eventually, he goes to Kwame Nkrumah to ask him to support the Congress. The problem is Nkrumah had been overthrown. Then he went to Sekou Touré. Sekou Touré, the head of Guinea, he was facing a possible invasion from the Portuguese. He couldn't do it. So he went to Nyerere, and Nyerere agreed to do it. And there were some prominent people in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Cortland Cox, a former Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee leader, who ended up serving as kind of the executive person who was doing coordination of this Congress on the ground. And you had a lot of skilled Africans in Africa at that time working in the Ujamaa villages, which we had met with a year earlier when we went. So this is a picture of me in the middle, and to my right, and your right, if you look at this, is a brother from Chicago who owned a bookstore in Chicago. His last name was Van, and who was also a state legislator. The person on the other side whose back is facing the camera is Simba Tayari, who was Pan-African People's Organization representative in Tanzania and who spoke Swahili fluently. He's still alive, and he sends me stuff every now and then on Facebook. Real good brother. And he worked in the economic development section of the Tanzanian government. And here we were dealing with discussing what was happening at this conference. This is a picture that you see when the show is introduced. To the left is Owusu Sadakawa. He had been former head of the African Liberation Support Committee nationwide, and at that time was in charge of the Malcolm X Liberation University. This was an attempt to build an African university in the United States. It was located in the South. That's me in the center. And Imamu Amiri Baraka, that's him on the right side. Now this was a major debate at the Congress. I chaired the political committee for North America. The Africans from the United States represented the largest delegation to the Sixth Pan-African Congress, with delegations coming from the Pacific Islands, all over Africa, Europe, and then, of course, the United States. This was a debate that was raging in the United States between Pan-Africanism versus Marxism-Leninism. Amiri Baraka on the right had been an advocate of Karinga's and Nguzo Sabra and had led the Black Political Assembly prior to this. And I described Owusu Sadakwe. Owusu Sadakwe had embraced a form of Marxism, and I thought Baraka was a cultural nationalist that he had flipped into a Maoist. And so we're having a debate on Pan-Africanism versus Marxism-Leninism. And I'll say this, I didn't lose that debate. But that was key, and it was a reason that John Henry Clark didn't go. I had wondered because I thought he didn't go because the delegation from Trinidad, a country ruled by Eric Williams, refused to have C.L.R. James in the delegation. C.L.R. James, one of the fathers of Pan-Africanism. It was his idea to have this Congress. So that was bad. So I thought that's why John didn't go. But John didn't go because he didn't like the fact that we were dealing with this issue. But this is an issue we had to deal with. And it's unfortunate that John wasn't there. He could have contributed a lot. So let me see if I find anything else here. This here is a 1977 issue of our newspaper, The African Awakener. And this is a report on the meeting that I had with Julius Nyerere in July 15, 1977, in which we had an exchange and we were trying to build an information center in Tanzania. Later, one of the leaders in Pan-African People's Organization, Thabiti Mtambuzi, ended up building a guest center right on the ocean in Zanzibar. And he's now building another one right now. He's an economic developer. So my radicalization had a lot to do with what I learned on the African continent, while at the same time I was undergoing change in the Black freedom movement. And two things I learned. On the African continent, I learned first that the best position that Africans could assume to help Africa was using our strategic position in the United States to aid in the liberation of Africa. At that point, it was the liberation of the southern colonies that were still under colonialism and were fighting armed struggle. But it was also the issue of Africa being liberated from neo-colonialism or indirect colonialism. So that trip to Africa dispelled a lot of my romantic ideas about Africa. And I realized that my real contribution would be here, supporting the struggles in Africa while we wage a struggle here. The second lesson that I learned was the African states of Africa are largely enemies of African people. And that in fact, many of the aims and objectives of this conference was frustrated by African leaders who didn't want Pan-Africanism. And so that was the second lesson, that the Pan-Africanism that's going to come that will liberate Africa is a Pan-Africanism of the people. And I had already begun to embrace a revolutionary consciousness. Now, this is my participation in an African Scholars Conference in Senegal in 2004. And the bald-headed person sitting in the middle or on the left of the picture is President Wade, the president of Tanzania. And this was a conference on Pan-Africanism. It was an African Scholars Conference. And I was honored to be asked to be the only African outside of Africa to chair a plenary, the biggest one and most important one, Pan-Africanism in the 21st century. And this is a meeting that has interrupted me chairing this plenary And so I'm going over to clarify some stuff with the president on where this is going to go later, and getting it clear that I'll be running this plenary later. The purpose of the plenary, the one that I chaired, was to present to the African Union demands that Africans abroad be made citizens in Africa, and that we be given seats at this point what's called the African Union, that is the organized, unified body in Africa. And we got those through. It was a lot of struggle, but we got those through. This is me giving the book, The Integration Trap, to this brother who was then Secretary General of the African Union. He's the one that was sitting next to President Waat. And, this conference was important because we're bringing together Francophone or French-speaking Africans, English-speaking Africans, and usually these are divided. And Watt was trying to create some unity there. This is, of course, Leonard and Rosalind Jeffries, who arrived a little late. They had missed our banquet the night before. And you see Rosalind, that's Leonard's wife. She's a wonderful lady, a real scholar, a art historian, and a very spiritual person. And Leonard, a beautiful brother. When you see me smiling, I don't smile all the time. I'm in the presence of people that I really love. And this is a brother that loves Africa and loves African people just as his wife does. This is James Smalls and myself. They had a banquet as a reception to honor all the delegates. Miriam Makeba performed live. You had other officials there. And this was a beautiful occasion. Wade Nobles, that you'll see in a minute, and Theophil Obenga, they were part of this delegation. This is Wade Nobles and I talking. I remember exactly what I was telling him. So let's see if there's anything else here. These are scenes of the Sixth Pan-African Congress, and right here, the second picture from the left are delegates from North America. I'm in there, and my friend Kehinde Solowazi is in there. And on the top to the left is Nyerere meeting with other leaders, African leaders. So the point is that for me, the transformation from reformist to revolutionary took the path of engaging in a reformist struggle that produced change for our people. And those changes, the most important for me, were the changes of thought pattern, philosophy, attitude pattern, behavior pattern. From Negro to African, and African to a revolutionary African. And this is what has sustained a lot of us. So I want to conclude by saying that in terms of my writings have been the place where I've been able to think through revolutionary transformations. So the book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, is the most important work of my life because having tapped into this higher mind, God gave me the secret basis for just societies. And this is a far better formulation of just societies than anything Marx could come up with. Societies where all the males and females are equally empowered to govern every phase of society. And this I term twinlinealism, meaning in the family structure, it's not uh, matrilineal, centered on the female, or patrilineal, centered on the last name of the male, or a matriarchy ruled by women, or patriarchy ruled by men. But twinlineal, meaning that in the family structure, which is the foundation for society, there's an equal empowerment of males and females that then feeds up to the entire society and leads to a consensus based democratic system. This is the basis for reorganizing society. When King talked about restructuring society, this is the basis for it. You hear me? And so I thought when I woke up, that was it. But then I found out there was a spiritual awakening that I needed to go through that came through the beautiful light. But I could only do that when I dealt with my own weaknesses of not being able to deal fully with integrating the feminine into the masculine in my life. Much better at the hard, rough warrior stuff than the soft feminine stuff. And so I went through a lot of changes. I've discussed these before. And then the other transformation, again, that came through the light. You're not going to get this in the European despiritualized system, is this book, Integration Trap, Generation Gap Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures. This is the best analysis of what's wrong today and the key that you have to unlock the door for what's right. And that is, if the forces that have hit us globally in the US have put us in a position to choose between two cultures, then we need to draw from the best of our culture, both African and African American, along with new innovations we make now to make the right political, economic, social choices. And so I've ended up in a place that I never expected, because I never expected that God would be giving me some ultimate answers for a revolution. But that's where I've ended up, and I'm not finished, you know. So twinlinealism, it is the key to healing our families, our communities. We are a nation within a nation that I didn't deal with today, and African people globally, because it coming from God's mind, it's the best prescription of the problem and the solution. So we end up where we started. We're looking at the making of Black revolutionaries, and we're concluding with the fact that drawing from the best of your culture and making new innovations along the road. I'm not saying you just stick to that. It's a basis for full freedom. So I hope you got something out of this. Hotep. Kurt Thomas, I'm glad you're reading the stuff, and let me know what you think of what you've read. SOZB, twinlineal is key to all greatness, a balance of power between male and female. Yeah, because that's all society is, you know. So how do you formulate that? And in families, it's a lot of different ways you do it, and then you work your way up in that. You know what I mean? Lao Tzu is advising people to look at the comments section of the Twa transmission of civilization through ancestral power. Yeah, look at all those shows because they lay the foundation for what I'm talking about here. Okay. SOZB, 3 videos on the Twa. Yeah, correct. And Kurt Thomas. Kurt Thomas makes a point that racism is a European construct. Correct. SOZB, Twa practiced male-female governance systems thousands of years before Kemet, uh, 10,000 years before the Greeks mutated from Africans. Look up his Twa series. Yeah, it's very, very important, you know. And God, when God gave me the formula for just societies, God was giving me the Twa, not just the formula. So I've been digging into that for the longest. That's where the foundation is. And then the other things that follow. Maggie Fields. Thank you, Maggie. Um, let's see. African words for strategies, African folk tales, teachings for us people around this world. Yeah, find out what they are in different African languages. The key thing is the art, and it's key to exercising power and being victorious and for just causes. Lao Tzu. Okay. Okay, there's some conversation going on here that's interesting. Okay. Lao Tzu, a good question. Lao Tzu always asks good questions, and I suspect he already has the answers. I suspect this is for the benefit of some that might want this answer. So, um, is there a difference between European conception of democracy and African? If there is, can you clarify, please? Yeah. Um, at least for what we know currently about European history, I don't know any place in which Europeans have actually practiced what is real democracy. They pass off republicanism as democracy. Um, that is the system encouraged by Aristotle in his book Politics. He makes the point that he favored a royal system, but he said the most stable would be this republican form that the West mistakenly or deliberately calls democracy. And he said this is the best form for stable government because you give people the sense that they have power through the vote, but they are voting for the same candidates. You know, that's their concept of democracy. So it's not only the sameness of the candidates because there's a filtering process that keeps certain people out that could provide an alternative. It's not only the system for selection, but it's who they represent. And in the case of the Greeks, the people who were allowed to vote in Athens and a few other city states, they were people who got to choose between the elite. So that's generally how their systems have worked. None of their systems that we know of today were based on the people making the decisions. And real democracy in Africa is a system where in classless age grade societies or in hunter gatherer systems, the whole people made the decisions on all important things. And that was just about everything, you know. And even with societies in which you had kings and queens at the local level, very often, the Asante, for example, it was all the males and females in the village that made the decision, you know, at the local level. And they particularly, um, they made decisions in general, starting with the lineage, because in African systems, it starts in the family system. So the lineage, which is a large grouping of people of the same bloodline, the chair of that, which in the Asante system is called opinion, originally was a female when they had female rule. And then it shifted to male female rule and it became a male. But the lineage council is chaired by an opinion who is a person who doesn't lie, doesn't, disrespect women, who is brave, um, who is a person of high character. That's the same person. Those are the same qualities that make you a candidate for kingship. The best person rule, in this case, the best man. The women have never had to conform to this. Since when are you going to question your mother's quality to be your mother? The women have always trumped all of this stuff. So, so the way the lineage is run is the way the village is run, the way the district and the way the region and the way the nation is run. And so when you get to the King's Council, then the King's Council, the decisions are made by the Queen Mother and the opinions or the lineage heads that make up the King's Council. And it's made up through all the males and females on the level of council making the decision. Whereas at the village level, it's all the males and females in the village. And that's why African historians agree consensus is the African way. That's why we were successful in the San Francisco Freedom Movement. I didn't know about the history of African democracy, but it's embedded in our culture. And so my rule was consensus. We couldn't make any decision on any campaign or anything unless everybody agreed to it, and that we didn't have anybody pulling us down after that. But my main reason for that was that everybody put their ideas into the pot. John Henry Clark, when I talked to him about this, he would say, the most important thing for this to work is respect your elders. Of course, he would say that, and that's true. However, in African systems, the Council of Elders could make recommendations to the village, but the village had the power to override it because it's all the males and females are equally empowered to govern every phase of society. That's the formula. And elders can be wrong. Of course, you might say all the people could be too. Not too much of a chance of it, but yeah, maybe. Okay, Lao Tzu is making this point. He says, the Dr. Obachashaka, what's your analysis, group of scholars, on the subject of fascism? Their analysis is that as capitalism collapses, it moves towards fascism. It's built into this economic system. Fascism doesn't have to be built into capitalism. Now capitalism is dictated by the owners and controllers of wealth or production, or in this case, of the computer-driven economy. So they built it in, so they're running this thing ultimately in the final analysis. But that isn't fascism because you haven't had installed a system where one, two, or a few people dictate everything, and that's it. And can dictate to the corporations as well. That can happen. One of the mistakes that a lot of the corporate leaders made in Germany was to think that, and political leaders, that they could control Hitler. And some people are making the same mistake on Trump. So it's a total dictatorship. And generally, fascism is going to rule out any say so from the people. And whatever is imposed from the top is just going to come down without any checks of any kind. So, law, um, you can forget about law, even though law is itself the Supreme Court, is checked by the people who own wealth. They generally incline towards their views, but you won't even have those checks, you know. So that's fascism, and the ultimate end of fascism is extermination. Spirit traveler. Okay, good comments, sir. SOZB. Um, Brother saying he doesn't think Africans have settled on their identity here. Largely they have, which is that we're black. Now we got some people that don't want that, but that I think is the general view, and some African Americans. Lao Tzu, wouldn't 40 plus million African people be more successful in securing their future if they were the majority in a few states versus scattered in 50 states? Yeah. Um, yeah. For a long time, that looked like that was not a possibility at all. The way things are going now, that's possible. And sometime in the future, maybe. And if so, it would be in the South. Lao Tzu is the lack of the concept of creation of a nation state within the Africans in America, nationalism, its fundamental weakness. Well, one wing of Black nationalism advocates that, and they put a considerable amount of work on that. So, yeah, but overall, that's not a consensus because of the power differential. People can't really see how that could happen right now, but it could happen. Okay, is there anything else here? Yeah, SOZB, good point. Kenya High Court blocked the Haiti police mission. Don't get it twisted. The Kenyan people are not for it, just like the Nigerian people are not for intervention in Niger. Yeah, good point. Well, I mean, if the people had their say so, Africa would be out of trouble, even with all of the things we've collected from colonialism. Because basically, the people are going to look out for their own interests. You know, you're not going to be able to come in and just take their resources. If Bill Gates is not going to come in and push all of his corporate systems for producing wealth for himself. Brother Shabazz, somebody answered you on that. King King had used the term integration, but he was never serious about it and eventually rejected that. Brother Shabazz, Haiti can make a good case for being the leaders of revolutionary thought and action in the Americas. I agree. Definitely. Of course, that would have to come from the people, not from the elite. Kurt Thomas, how do we reconnect with the mother principle when the world pushes toward non-real life interactions? Multiverse, immersion subdues the ka, sum sum, or soul. It does not subsume it. The soul, the ka, your destiny, uh, or ori, these are forces within us. But it's a society that has been so spiritualized that it has created falseness and turned it into reality. Um, so it's by reconnecting with ourselves. And to the extent that we do, that's where the most important things that we have come from, you know. So it's not buying into that culture, you know. Yeah, good point here about reconnecting with Africa. Brother Shabazz, do the masses have a critique of capitalism, or do we mostly endorse and reproduce it? No, it doesn't. Though some, from their own life experience, see how vicious it is. But yeah, this system is set up to keep that critique out, not only from us. If you look at some of the foremost leftist thinkers among whites, um, like Noam Chomsky, he's got a critique on this. He has hardly ever appeared on any major news show or any kind of television show, yet he's supposed to be one of the world's greatest linguists and a major thinker among whites. And he's Jewish and conscious, you know. So the alternative views are shut up or shut out. Okay, let's see if there's anything else here. Dap Daddy, right on, brother. Okay. Okay, this is one here. Hadza TV. How do we reconcile equality of the sexes with the patriarchy of the Abrahamic or Hamic tradition? Well, not just that tradition. It also ties into Islam. And then patriarchy transcends religion. It ties into all of these systems and has their root. Okay, Shonda. It has its root in nomadism coming out of Russia, the Ukraine, and the Caucasus Mountains. And so that's its origin. So it is proved to be dysfunctional. It is proved to work against the interests not only of females, but of humanity. Um, so, like the causes of global warming that come from a culture that wants to wage war on nature, um, similarly, um, a culture of dictatorship where females are put in a subordinate position contributes to that same thing. That is death of relationships and families that work and can produce love and of the planet for different reasons, but similar. So It's a matter of how we organize and how we present the information to popularize this. Because the key thing is, trilinealism is key to African and African American culture and many of the cultures of the world originally. And it makes sense. And it's the key to getting away from a few having everything and the majority having next to nothing. And it's the key to real love, real self-respect, real peace. So we're in a society where everything's upside down, so it's turning it right side up. So that's a struggle. So I hope you got something out of this. As I said, this sets the tone for the rest of the year at least. Hotep.